See, anthropology is a subject or a science in which theory is of great importance. And it is also a science in which theory is closely bound with its practice. Anthropologists, are involved in what is called as ethnographic research. I will discuss more about ethnography when I start research methodology with you. But ethnography literally means writing about the people of the world. Just like biography, I told you this, we have ethnography. In biography, we isolate an individual and capture his entire life and sketch it in the form of a book. In the case of ethnography, we are isolating a culture and writing everything about that culture. So, ethnographic research and ethnography is the practice of writing about the people of the world. And it is also a kind of research which involves making sense of people's thoughts. Because normally we end up doing what we are thinking. And for you to understand why we are doing something the way we do, we need to peep into the minds of the people to capture the thoughts of the people. And not only isolating a culture and writing everything about it and making sense of the people's ideas and thoughts, but ethnography is essentially trying to ultimately define what is human nature. Encyclopedia Britannica's definition of anthropology, a discipline devoted to a discourse on human nature. And the only way probably in social and cultural anthropology we can actually make sense of human nature is through this intensive research, what we call as ethnography. Theory without ethnography is meaningless, and ethnography without theory is also meaningless. So, anthropologists always approach a culture or a human society on the basis of certain theoretical considerations they have about that culture and proceed with their research. This is nothing to do with anthropology, but essentially a theory is made up of 4 components or 4 elements. The first one is questions. The second, assumptions. Questions, assumptions. The third, methods. And the final one is evidence. So, questions, assumptions, methods and evidence together constitute what we call as a theory. And just like any other theory, even anthropological theory is made up of these 4 elements. And when it comes to anthropology, there are 2 very important special attributes of anthropological theory. One is holism, the second one is comparison. Holistic, historical, comparative approach to human cultures is anthropology. I told you this in the introductory class. Holism is observing the society as a whole, and comparison is examining every society in relationship with other societies, examining every culture in relation to other cultures. So, let us examine each of these components. First, questions. There are very important questions that anthropologists ask, and most of the questions that anthropologists ask are related to the nature of culture, the nature of society, nature of culture, nature of society, and also the nature of human species itself. So every anthropological theory, I would say, is more or less raising questions vis-a-vis the human society, the human culture, and the human species itself. We ask questions about the history of society and culture. We keep asking questions like, what came first, private property or communal property? Or we may ask even questions that are associated with contemporary issues, like how do the social institutions work? Or how does the culture interact with the development process? Or does the Panchayati Raj system influence the way the traditional authority is perceived by the tribal societies? So the kind of questions anthropologists ask are many, and depending on the nature of questions they ask, we have different approaches to anthropological studies. The second component of every theory is assumptions. What is an assumption? An assumption is a notion that an anthropologist has regarding the humanity. You approach the human society, the human culture, or the human beings in general with certain notions that you have about them. And based on these assumptions, you approach those human cultures to test out whether your assumptions are true or they are false. Take for example, you go with the assumption that all the human beings are basically very inventive. Whenever there is a problem, they invent things. Or you may go with the assumption that humans are basically uninventive in nature. They will not invent anything, they simply look at others if they have any solution and they simply borrow it. If you believe in that humans are inventive, that means you are looking at the role humans play in their own cultural evolution. If you believe they are uninventive, but they keep borrowing things from other cultures, then you are trying to understand the nature of cultural diffusion. We can go with the assumption that society creates humans, or we can go with the assumption that humans create society. So essentially, assumption is the notion that we have before we approach, and it is these assumptions that we are trying to test out, and these assumptions is what makes anthropologists significantly different from each other in their approaches. You have evolutionists, diffusionists, you have functionalists, you have structuralists. So that's the reason why you have a whole list of different theories. And the third element of every research or every theory is method. The kind of methods you use to collect data, the kind of information that you are seeking from the people has to happen through a method, a methodological fashion. Whether you will use observation or you will use comparison or you will use interview or you will use questionnaires. Whether you will be doing a field work or you will be doing a literature survey. All these methods have developed over 200 years in anthropology. And research methodology is all about looking at those various methods that we are going to see later on. And these methods help anthropologists collect data, gather evidences, case studies, so that, making use of this information, an anthropologist can test his assumptions and ask the questions that he would like to ask. So, method is an integral component of theory. And finally is evidence. So, whatever assumptions that you have, if you want to prove them to be right, or whatever the conclusions you are making, you want to prove that they are right, you need evidence. Evidence is all about collecting facts about a culture or collecting facts about a society. And the nature of evidence that you are looking for depends on your problem area, whatever area that you are researching in. Theory depends on evidence. Evidence proves or disproves a theory. So, evidence is an integral component of theory making. And based on your theoretical perspectives, you will choose the methods, the nature of questions will vary, evidences you will gather and make your conclusions. And the history of anthropology, as when you examine the history of anthropology, the agenda of anthropology never remains static. Anthropology probably is as old as the humanity itself, but as an academic discipline, anthropology came into existence only about 200 years ago, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. And the history of anthropology involved a transition from diachronic studies to synchronic studies. Diachronic studies is, your historical method. We started looking at extinct cultures, primitive cultures, and later on anthropologists from diachronic study, they transitioned to synchronic study. They started looking at the contemporary societies. They started looking at the societies not as a part of the timeline, but the way they exist as on today. And from synchronic studies, anthropology has transitioned to becoming an interactive study. From diachronism to synchronicism, from synchronic study to interactionist study. Diachronic study is studying things in relation to time. That means evolution, origin and growth. Synchronic study is the relationship of things to one single time, one present time. And interaction studies involve the relationship between man, society and culture. How do they interact with each other? So you see, the agenda of anthropology never remained static. That means in the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of anthropology, when it came into existence as an academic discipline in 19th century, the anthropologists had a different approach to study man. They were more involved in whether man evolved, do cultures evolve, or they come into existence because of diffusion. And by the time you come to the 20th century, the focus shifted to synchronic study. We call them functionalist approaches. And then interactionist study, the individual interaction with social situations and culture. So there was never a static agenda. Different periods of time, anthropology was looking at different aspects of human nature. And not only that, even the theories have different emphasis. Some theories were emphasizing on society, whereas other theories were emphasizing on culture. Some other theories were emphasizing on human psychology. This is what is the characteristic feature of theory in anthropology. Don't expect one theory to be an extension of an earlier one. Each one is independent, autonomous, and a different kind of a fad or a fashion of a group of anthropologists. That means what? From diachronic to synchronic, synchronic to interactive, some emphasizing on society, some on culture, some on psychology and personality. The history of anthropological theory is characterized by what we call as agenda hopping. This can be a question for you. What is agenda hopping? So, history of anthropological thought. how the anthropological thought evolved is what we are going to look at in this chapter, which is called in your syllabus as anthropological theory.